The Pentax K1000 was released in 1976 and has gone on to become one of the most popular cameras in the modern era. That is, the modern era of single lens reflex cameras. What makes this really interesting and somewhat astounding is production of the camera continued until 1997, meaning that it remained in production for 21 years and largely unchanged. In fact, there were, aside from a couple cosmetic things and things that people really don't see, the camera that was released in 1976 is essentially the same as the final camera that rolled off the production line in 1997. What makes this camera even more interesting is that as cameras began to get more complicated, more automated, more electronic, this camera gained in popularity. Why is that? Well, let's talk about several things. In fact, this camera had no automation. It did have a light meter, but it had an all-manual, it had a manual shutter, it had manually set aperture, it was a manual focus camera. It had a single battery cell that powered only the meter, so that is, if the battery died, the camera kept functioning. And so this is a very, very interesting camera. How it never changed during its entire production run, and yet continues to be a very sought-after camera today. Let's take a look at the K1000 and maybe we'll learn a few things. The K1000 arrived on the market 1 year after the introduction of three other models in 1975, the K2, the KM, and the KX. When this was introduced, a fifth version, second version of the K2, the K2 DMD, was also introduced. The K2 was an auto exposure camera. The DMD model allowed for the use of a data back and also a motor drive. None of the other K cameras were able to use these accessories. So to be clear, there are two distinctions here. One are the K model cameras, and the other is the K mount line of lenses. The K mount, of course, replaced the 42mm screw mount. The K mount lenses were used both by the K series of cameras as well as the M series of cameras. And the M series, of course, was the MX, ME, and all of the other future variants of the small-bodied M cameras. As you can see from the outward appearance of this camera, it's very basic. There's not even a self-timer lever, which you normally see here. On the top deck, things are pretty clean. What you have is your rewind crank on this side. You have a hot shoe, and you'll see the small red X here, indicating that it is a true hot shoe. There's no other contact points here, so there was no dedicated flash. You have your shutter speed dial, and you have your film speed setting. In this case, it's ASA because you can see that it's marked ASA. ASA is equivalent to ISO. Your film speed range ran from, I believe it's 1600 down to 20. Let me take a quick look because there were a couple cameras that bumped that up to 3200, but I'm not sure that this is one of them. Your film speed settings ran from 3200, which was quite high for that time, down to 20. So that's quite a range. This is a later model K1000, so it's possible that the earlier models, meaning those released in 1976, might have been limited to 1600. Regardless, this one does have quite an expansive film speed range, should you wish to push your film much faster than expected. Also, just in case you happen to come across some Kodak 3200 speed film. Over here you have your frame counter, your shutter release. Notice there's no shutter release lock. And then finally, you have this small little indicator. So how that works is once you advance your film, it turns orange to let you know that your shutter's been tensioned and your film has been advanced and you're ready to take your next photo. After you depress the shutter release, you'll notice that turns white, or whatever color it is underneath there. The film advance is nicely shaped. It also has a plastic tip, making it very comfortable to hold. And you can advance the film either in a single stroke, fairly long, or you can do it in small increments, whichever you prefer. That means that it's a ratcheted film advance. The back of the camera is very plain. All you have is your eyepiece for the viewfinder. Notice you have no little frame here to hold the end of the box. On the bottom of the camera, you'll see a couple things. One quite prominently says State of Louisiana, so that meant that this camera was owned and used by the state of Louisiana. Couldn't tell you what division, and in fact, I couldn't even tell you how I came about this camera, although I did buy it, but I don't recall who the seller was or anything about them. There's a small battery chamber cover right here. Here's your tripod socket, and it is in alignment with the center of the lens. And then finally, you'll see a small little sticker. This is actually a sticker, not engraved. And it says, what's it say? Oh yes, body assembled in Hong Kong. Meaning that this likely was one of the later cameras. The earlier versions of the camera were made in Japan. So let's pop open the back. Opening the back is done in the traditional manner. That is, you lift up on the film, rewind, crank, and the back pops open. Film runs traditionally left to right. Here you have your film rails, you have your little sprocket spindle, and you have your take-up spool. At the base of the take-up spool is a small serrated portion that allows you to help the film get started, or probably if you have that leader, just to make sure it catches. Of course, what you would do is you would probably do something like this, wind it partially. Once it's caught, close your back, complete the stroke on that, and then fire off 2 blanks. It has a pressure plate, as do nearly all 35mm cameras. I'm going to say all 35mm cameras. Presumably, there wouldn't be any cameras that do not have a pressure plate, except those that use the cartridge film, Instamatic cartridge film. Anyway, roll the pressure plate. As always, is to keep the film flat against the film rails, so when you take your photo, you'll get as sharp a photo as possible, because the film will be as flat as possible against the film gate. And it's always dependent, of course, upon the taking lens being of sufficient quality to be able to record a sharp image. This uses a horizontally traveling cloth shutter. I believe it's rubber coated. I don't believe the shutter itself is rubber, because that would probably cause issues down the road with it tearing. I really should take a real close look at that. However, it uses the same shutter as in the KX, the KM, and its predecessor model, the Pentax Spotmatic SP1000, which we'll look at in just a moment. So as I mentioned, the appeal of this camera is that it's just a camera. It's just a camera with a shutter speed dial, an aperture ring, focusing ring, and you are responsible for setting exposure. The type of meter in here is a battery-powered cadmium sulfide, which at the time was on the way out. In fact, a couple camera makers had already moved on from that, including Pentax when it released its MX and ME cameras. This camera and the KM both used CDS. The K2, I'm not entirely sure what that used, but I know that the KX used a silicon blue cell, and that was becoming the dominant cell. The knock against the cadmium sulfide meters is that they can be somewhat sluggish, particularly when you have those changes in light. So if you move from, and generally it happens if you move from light to dark. If you move from dark to light, the needle will react fairly swiftly. So moving from light to dark, it has what's called a memory effect, and it takes a while for that needle to slowly respond. You'll see how it just moves a little bit slower. The viewfinder is very basic. There's no shutter speed information, no aperture information. All there is you just have your basic viewfinder. You have a central microprism spot surrounded by what appears to be a Fresnel circle on a ground glass screen. Very, very basic. There's no split image focusing aid. There was a Pentax K1000 SE that did offer the split image. I don't know that I've run across that. I haven't really looked for them. So what about this camera today? Still a user? Yeah, it is. You know what makes this camera great is because it is such a basic camera, it really doesn't do anything for you aside from helping you set the exposure. It really forces you to learn the relationship between shutter speeds and apertures, and also to focus, and focus in a rather primitive way because it doesn't have a focusing aid. Oddly enough, the price of these cameras continued to remain consistent throughout the years, and in fact can be somewhat difficult to find. If you're really interested in purchasing a Pentax K1000 but can't find one, what are some of the options for you? Well, one of the options is going to be this camera. Option number one is the Pentax SP1000. This actually is the predecessor to the K1000. Its viewfinder is identical. It also uses a CDS meter. Notice that there is no self-timer either. When you look at the top deck of the SP1000, you'll notice that it's very similar to the K1000. The SP1000 has a little small film reminder dial, and basically it tells you what type of film you have loaded, and that's pretty much it. This has the same range of shutter speeds, running from 1/1000th of a second down to 1 second plus B. The ASA range on this camera is 1600 down to 20. This also uses a rubber-coated cloth focal plane shutter. You'll notice the frame counter is identical. It also has that little small orange indicator when the film has been advanced and shutter has been tensioned. Notice that it turns orange. And so when you release the shutter, that indicator then disappears, just as in the K1000. The viewfinder also is identical, so then I'll put those two side by side, and you can see how they both use that center micro prism spot, surrounded by that Fresnel collar on a ground glass screen. The small cutout for the meter is identical as well. Aside from the fact that this one uses a screw mount and this one uses a K-mount lens, they otherwise are, I would say, identical. Also, you'll notice that this is an all-metal film advance. It's polished, so it's very comfortable to use. There's no sharp edges on it. The SP1000 also has an accessory shoe rather than a hot shoe, and this accessory shoe is removable should you wish to not be bothered with it. You could still slide your flash unit in here, but you would have to use the cable that would then plug into one of these two synchronization ports, and you'll see there's two, one marked FP for focal plane. That always means bulb flash, and then there's X for electronic flash synchronization. What about this switch here? What's this about? This turns your meter off and on. It also stops down the lens at the same time. So when you want to meter a scene, you would have to push that up. It would stop down the lens. You would meter your scene. Then you would pull it down, which would open the lens. Then you could take your photo. Somewhat inconvenient, not somewhat very inconvenient. This is powered by a single 1.35 volt mercury cell, no longer available. You could still use a hearing aid battery, which is 1.4 volts, and the difference in voltage is only, I believe, 3.6 or 3.7%. Not enough to make any difference. So you might say, you know what? I don't want to deal with the screw mount lens. I really only want a K-mount lens. Are there any other options? But I want something that operates like the Pentax K1000. I don't want a highly automated camera, and I want a Pentax. Option number two is the Pentax KM. Let's look at option number two. The Pentax KM is almost identical to the K1000, and the only change is that you have a depth of field preview, which you don't have on the K1000, and you have a self-timer. Also, you have two flash synchronization ports, and they're identical to the ones that are on the SP1000. That is, one is marked FP, focal plane for bulb flash, and the other one is marked X for electronic flash synchronization. Like the K1000, it has a traditional hot shoe, and like the K1000, just a single contact point, so there was no dedicated flash unit. Nearly any flash unit is going to work. When we line up these three cameras side by side or front to back, you'll see that they once again are nearly identical, with these two really being identical. The only difference is, as if you notice, is the inclusion of these two controls here, and of course there's two flash synchronization ports on this side. This has a film reminder under the rewind knob, which the K1000 does not have. This also uses a rubber-coated cloth focal plane shutter with shutter speeds running from 1/1000th of a second down to 1 second plus B. The film speed range on this camera is also 3200 down to 20. So it is identical to this. Because this camera, the KM, was released in 1975, a year before the K1000, it's very possible that the K1000 also had the 3200 speed upon its release. I would have to find an earlier camera to really be able to say that that is the case definitively. As can be seen from the top of the camera, they all really are identical. You know what? Let's take a look at the weight of these cameras. Because I have 3 different lenses, a Pentax M, a standard K-mount lens, and then also one of the older screw-mount Takumars, that's not going to give me an accurate weight. So what we're going to do is just weigh the body. So let's come in first with the Pentax K1000, and that is 1 pound, 5.3 ounces. So 1 pound, 5.3 ounces. How about the SP1000 predecessor? 1 pound, 5.9 ounces. So that is 0.6 ounces different. That is slightly more than half an ounce difference. So it's probably not a weight that you're even going to notice. And finally, let's take a look at the Pentax KM. 1 pound, 6.0 ounces. So lightest, slightly heavier, and slightly heavier. So this is 0.7 ounces heavier than the K1000. Again, that would be imperceptible to most people. Just for fun, let's weigh the 3 lenses. So this is the M version of the 50mm 1.7. I'm going to guess this is going to be the lightest of all of them. And that is 6.6 ounces. How about the Takumar? This is an f2 55mm lens. And that is 6.7 ounces, so just 0.1 ounce difference. Once again, very close. And finally, we have the 1.8 55mm lens. 8 ounces. So now this one actually is quite a bit heavy. Not quite a bit, but it is a couple of ounces heavier than the other 2 lenses. Remember, the M 6.6. This is slightly more than 1 ounce heavier than this one and 1 ounce heavier than the Takumar. Remember that the M lenses were intended for the Pentax M cameras, which were compact and therefore smaller than their non-M counterparts. And you can see it here. This is a 1.7, this is 1.8. They're basically the same aperture, except for marketing purposes. And you can see that the 1.8 is a longer lens, and this one is much more compact. How about the f2 and the 1.8? They're slightly, they're, roughly comparable, although this one still is a longer lens and heavier, remember. So this one came in at 6.7 ounces, and this one came in at 8 ounces. So this one actually weighs, 1.3 ounces more than the original Takumar. And that's surprising because the Takumars tended to be mostly brass and steel and glass, and this has probably had some, has this little rubber focusing ring, and there might be some, and I guess that would be the only synthetic material in the construction of the lens. So if I were buying a camera today and I really wanted a K1000, I probably would continue to search until I found a K1000, at least a usable one. As always, when you're buying an older camera, make sure that it works. I did buy a camera recently in which the prism had begun to desilver, and at that point, the only thing you can do is replace the prism, and that always requires a donor body. Things like dust in the viewfinder or crumbling foam seals, those can be replaced fairly easily. And that's not what I would call irreparable damage. If I was buying a K1000 today, what would I do? I probably, if you really have your heart set on a K1000, by all means, wait until you find a good deal on one. I think the prices on these really get too high that probably don't justify the type of camera that it is. So if I were to do that, I would opt for actually a very clean Pentax KM. I bought this one recently for about $75. Came with a very nice lens, as you can see. It's in great condition, works fine. Or you can opt for this Pentax Spotmatic SP1000, and this is the predecessor of the K1000. Again, very nice camera. It's going to be a bit more limited, with that weird whole metering switch on the side. If I were to buy this one, I probably would just use a separate handheld meter and skip that onboard meter, because even today, it's sort of a pain in the neck. And you can still learn about photography and metering a scene just by using a regular handheld meter. I think I purchased this camera for about $55. The body's still a little bit soiled, but it's very clean. I did have to clean the viewfinders in all three cameras, and they cleaned up very well. I think the view through the Pentax Spotmatic, it's slightly dimmer than the view through the K1000 and the KM. The view through these two cameras is nearly identical. It's a fairly large, bright image. Here it's large, but not as bright. So choice one. If you're okay with not having the K1000 name here, go with the Pentax KM. It's actually a better camera because it has the depth of field preview button and it has a self-timer. I doubt you'll be using bulb flash, but if you do, you have that option here. Or you could go with the Pentax SP1000. And so what does the success of the Pentax K1000 tell us? What it says is the photographers still are in search of a very basic, reliable 35mm SLR. One that doesn't need to contain a lot of frills. It doesn't need auto exposure. It doesn't require multi-modes. It just requires a reliable camera with a reliable shutter, controls where you expect them to be, and one that is easy to operate and easy to learn to use. And as we move deeper into digital photography, I think it's a lesson that can be learned. Today's digital cameras often feature multi-modes, the ability to take movies, live view, auto exposure, autofocus, various shooting modes, PM, A, intelligent auto, etc., etc. But if you're a photographer who's become interested in film and you simply want a very basic, reliable camera, one of the Pentax models is going to be right for you. And so that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, think about giving me a like or subscribe. Feel free to leave a comment below, and if you disagree with what I have to say, say so too. I'm all right with that. Or you can send me an email at contact@camera-talk.net and click that icon in the lower right corner of the screen for more videos about cameras and photography. And I hope to see you on the next video.